Danielle Parker adjusted the strap of her leather bag as she stepped into the first-class cabin, her movement smooth, practiced. The gentle hum of conversation filled the air, passengers settling into their plush seats as flight attendants bustled around, assisting travelers with their luggage. Danielle was used to this environment, used to flying, used to the quiet luxury of first class. But most of all, she was used to being watched. It happened nearly every time she flew as a passenger. The moment she walked into first class, curious glances turned into judgmental stares. As a black woman, dressed sharply in a tailored blazer and slacks, she saw it in their faces. The unspoken question, how did she afford this seat? She ignored it. Danielle had been in the aviation industry long enough to recognize these interactions for what they were. Small-minded assumptions wrapped in polite expressions. She wouldn't let them rattle her. She reached her assigned seat, 2A, a spacious window seat near the front of the cabin. With precision, she lifted her bag into the overhead compartment, clicking it into place. Just as she turned to take her seat, a voice interrupted her. "Ma'am, I think you might be in the wrong section," said a flight attendant, her voice professional but laced with condescension. Danielle turned slowly. The woman was in her mid-30 seconds, with a sleek blonde ponytail and a name tag that read Heather. Her smile was tight, polite in the way that made it clear she didn't believe Danielle belonged here. Danielle arched an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" Heather gestured toward the economy cabin behind them. "This is first class," she said, her smile unwavering. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Danielle didn't react immediately. Instead, she reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out her boarding pass, holding it up with a calm, deliberate motion. "Seat 2A, she said, voice steady. Heather's eyes flickered over the ticket, her expression shifting ever so slightly. For a moment there was surprise, then something else. Embarrassment, maybe? Or just irritation that she had been proven wrong. "Oh," Heather said, recovering quickly. "My mistake." She took a step back, forcing another tight-lipped smile. "Enjoy your flight." Danielle offered a small nod, taking her seat without another word. As Heather turned, she caught a glimpse of another flight attendant, a brunette in her early 20s, watching the exchange with amusement. The two women shared a glance, and just as they walked toward the galley, Danielle heard it. A quiet chuckle. Danielle exhaled slowly, tapping her fingers lightly against the armrest. It never failed. No matter how many times she flew, no matter how much she had achieved in her career, there was always someone who saw her and assumed less. She glanced around the cabin. A middle-aged man in a crisp gray suit adjusted his tie, stealing a glance in her direction. His expression was unreadable, but Danielle had seen it before, that same look of curiosity, skepticism, quiet disbelief. She turned away, unwilling to give it another thought. A few minutes later, another flight attendant arrived, pushing a tray of welcome drinks down the aisle. "Champagne or orange juice?" she asked each passenger, her tone light and professional. When she reached Danielle's row, her smile shifted, not disappearing entirely, but changing. The name tag read Melissa. As Danielle reached for a glass of champagne, Melissa hesitated, then pulled the tray back slightly. "Would you prefer something from Coach?" she asked, her voice filled with artificial sweetness. "We have a few options back there if this isn't really your style." Danielle's hand hovered in midair for a fraction of a second before she slowly looked up at Melissa. Their eyes met, the meaning behind the words crystal clear. She could have said something. She could have called Melissa out on it, asked why she assumed she wouldn't want the same champagne as everyone else in first class. But instead, she simply responded, "This will do," taking the flute and setting it down on her tray table. Melissa's smile twitched, her composure wavering for just a second before she quickly moved to the next row. Danielle took a slow breath, centering herself. She had spent a lifetime navigating these moments. The polite exclusions, the lingering stares, the microaggressions wrapped in customer service smiles. She could have put them all in their place with a single sentence, but she chose silence, for now. Minutes later, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome aboard Flight 326 with non-stop service to New York. We're expecting a smooth ride today, so sit back, relax, and enjoy your flight." Danielle closed her eyes briefly, exhaling as the engines roared to life. The irony of the announcement wasn't lost on her. People could talk about a smooth ride all they wanted, but for some people, it was never truly smooth. She adjusted in her seat, her grip tightening slightly around the stem of her champagne flute. This was her world. She had dedicated her entire career to it, mastered it. And yet, here she was, treated like she was out of place in a space she had earned. Danielle knew exactly who she was. She didn't need their validation, and soon enough, the people who doubted her would realize just how wrong they were. Danielle Parker took a slow sip of her champagne, letting the cool liquid settle on her tongue. Her fingers rested lightly against the glass, her posture composed, but beneath the surface, irritation simmered. She had chosen silence when Melissa, the flight attendant, had subtly questioned whether the first-class drink selection was her style. She had held her tongue when Heather had assumed she was in the wrong seat, but she wasn't blind. She wasn't deaf to the whispers, the sideways glances. The way the energy in the first-class cabin shifted the moment she took her seat. Across the aisle, an older woman, pearls around her neck, a designer scarf draped over her shoulders, was staring. She wasn't outright rude, but her curiosity was palpable, her gaze lingering for just a second too long before she quickly looked away. Danielle had seen it before. It wasn't the outright overt racism of another era. It was the subtle kind. The kind that existed in quiet exclusions, in unspoken doubts, in the way people like Danielle were treated like anomalies in spaces they had every right to be in. She straightened slightly in her seat, willing herself to push past the frustration. She had learned a long time ago that moments like this weren't about proving herself. They were about knowing she didn't have to. The plane had just begun taxiing when the woman across from her finally spoke. "So, dear," she said, tilting her head slightly, "are you traveling for work?" Danielle turned, offering the woman a polite, unreadable expression. "I am," she replied. The woman gave a tight smile, her fingers adjusting the clasp on her purse. "Ah, I see. And what do you do?" Danielle had no doubt that if she had been a white man in a business suit, this question wouldn't have come up at all. She could already hear the assumptions forming behind the woman's polite expression. Maybe she's an athlete. Maybe she's a model. Maybe she's in entertainment. Because people like this never assumed she was a corporate executive, never assumed she was someone with power, with status, with authority. Danielle let the silence stretch just a little longer than necessary before answering. "I'm a pilot," she said simply. The woman blinked. "A pilot?" Danielle gave a slow nod. "Like for a private company?" "No," Danielle replied. "I fly commercial." A flicker of something crossed the woman's face. She hesitated for half a second, then quickly forced another smile. "Well, isn't that impressive?" she said. "You must be very unique." Danielle exhaled slowly, a tight smile curving her lips. There it was, that word, unique. As if her career, her accomplishments, her presence in this cabin were some kind of exception. As if the idea of a black woman flying a plane was so rare it barely seemed possible. She had heard it before, and she knew exactly what it meant. She could have corrected the woman. She could have told her that there were thousands of black female pilots across the world, though not nearly enough, thanks to barriers like the very assumptions being placed on her right now. But instead, she simply nodded, her voice smooth. "I suppose I am." The woman studied her for a moment longer before finally turning back to her own seat, her expression unreadable. Danielle refocused on the flight attendants moving through the cabin, taking drink orders and preparing for takeoff. Heather had returned, her movements efficient as she passed out menus, but her demeanor had shifted. Where before she had been quick to assume Danielle was in the wrong, now she barely looked at her. At all. Danielle had seen this too, the way people, when forced to confront their incorrect assumptions, would overcompensate with avoidance. It was a different kind of exclusion, but an exclusion nonetheless. A small, familiar sigh left her lips as she flipped through the menu. This wasn't just about one flight attendant, or one passenger, or one conversation. It was about a pattern, a lifetime of having to prove herself in spaces where others were simply accepted. She had been here before. She would be here again. And the worst part? She knew that when it truly mattered, if something went wrong on this flight, if the passengers needed someone to step up, all these same people would look to her for leadership without a second thought. And they wouldn't question whether she belonged then. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane took off, the faint hum of the engines filling the space. Danielle stared out the window, watching the ground shrink beneath them, feeling the familiar pull of altitude as they ascended. She had spent thousands of hours in the sky. She had guided aircraft through storms, through turbulence, through emergencies that had tested every ounce of her skill. She had done it all flawlessly, confidently, because this was where she belonged. And yet, here she was, in the very world she had mastered, being treated like a visitor in her own domain. She smirked slightly at the thought, shaking her head. It wasn't her who was out of place. It was their expectations that needed adjusting. And soon enough, whether they liked it or not, that adjustment was coming. Danielle Parker leaned back in her seat, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the tray table as the plane reached cruising altitude. The initial tension from boarding had eased slightly, but the undercurrent of subtle hostility remained, woven into every glance, every hushed conversation, every interaction she had with the crew and passengers around her. She had experienced this kind of treatment before, Yet it never ceased to amaze her how predictable it was. The same cycle, over and over. First the skepticism, then the exclusion. And now came the thinly veiled disrespect, not loud enough to cause a scene, but just persistent enough to make her presence feel unwelcome. Across the aisle, the older woman who had questioned her earlier was still sneaking glances in her direction. Her expression carefully neutral, but her curiosity lingering. And then there were the flight attendants. Heather and Melissa moved through the first-class cabin with practiced efficiency, but their behavior toward Danielle had subtly changed. It was clear they now understood she belonged in this seat. Yet, rather than correcting their earlier assumptions, they doubled down in a new way, making sure she felt as invisible as possible. Heather avoided looking at her altogether. When she passed by to offer refills on drinks, she skipped over Danielle's row, pretending not to notice her empty glass. Melissa wasn't much better. When she came by to collect meal selections, she addressed everyone in the row except Danielle. Danielle watched silently, waiting to see if Melissa would correct herself. She didn't. Instead, she turned to walk away. Danielle's voice cut through the air, smooth but firm. "Excuse me." Melissa stopped, hesitated, then turned back, feigning surprise. "Oh, I'm sorry, did I miss you?" Danielle's gaze remained steady. "Looks that way." Melissa's smile was tight. "My mistake. What would you like for dinner?" Danielle took a deliberate pause before answering, her tone unwavering. "I'll have the salmon." Melissa scribbled something on her notepad and nodded quickly before walking away, too quickly, as if escaping an uncomfortable confrontation. Danielle exhaled, pressing her lips together. She could already hear the internal justifications running through Melissa's mind. "It was just a mistake. I didn't mean anything by it." But that was the thing about microaggressions. They were never direct, never loud enough to be called out without sounding petty. They were subtle, deniable, wrapped in a layer of politeness. But Danielle had learned how to recognize them. She had learned that when people couldn't exclude her outright, they found other ways to diminish her presence. Minutes later, Heather returned with a tray, delivering meals to the passengers. Danielle observed the way she placed each tray down carefully, her movements precise, her demeanor composed. But when she reached Danielle's row, her approach was different. The tray landed just a little harder, the silverware rattling against the plate. Heather didn't meet her eyes. "Here you go," she said, her tone clipped, almost mechanical. Then she turned and walked away before Danielle had the chance to respond. Danielle glanced down at her meal, inhaling slowly. It was a message, intentional or not. A small, almost imperceptible display of resentment. "I don't want you here." She had seen this exact behavior in corporate boardrooms, in restaurants, in business class lounges. Places where people like Heather and Melissa assumed she didn't belong. And when confronted with the truth, when forced to acknowledge that their assumptions had been wrong, they never admitted fault. They simply changed tactics, shifting from skepticism to avoidance, from condescension to quiet hostility. Danielle had the power to call it out, to make a scene, to demand an apology. But she also knew how that would play out. Heather and Melissa would act shocked, hurt, confused. "I was just doing my job. I didn't mean anything by it. Why are you making this about race?" And then, suddenly, she would become the problem, the angry black woman in first class who made everyone uncomfortable. She had learned, long ago, that silence could be just as powerful as confrontation. So instead, she picked up her fork, took a bite of her meal, and let them sit with their discomfort. Because whether they liked it or not, she was here. And she wasn't going anywhere. A few rows ahead, a man in a navy suit leaned toward his seatmate, murmuring something under his breath. His companion, a younger woman, glanced back at Danielle before laughing softly. Danielle didn't need to hear the words to understand the sentiment. She had seen the way people whispered about her presence in spaces like this before. It was the same look she had gotten when she had walked into her first flight training class, when she had taken control of the cockpit for the first time, when she had been introduced to new colleagues as a senior captain and watched them do a double take. And now, here it was again. The same doubt, the same assumptions, the same quiet mockery. Danielle took a slow breath, letting the noise of the cabin fade into the background. She reminded herself of the truth. She had spent years mastering this craft. She had flown through storms, guided planes through emergencies, made impossible landings with the calm precision of a true expert. She had worked harder than most of the people on this plane could even imagine, because she had no choice but to be twice as good, twice as prepared, twice as flawless. And still, this was how she was seen, not as a captain, not as a leader in aviation, but as an outsider, an anomaly, someone to be questioned and dismissed. Danielle gripped the armrest lightly, steadying herself. Let them whisper, because soon enough, they would realize just how wrong they were. Danielle Parker had spent her entire life preparing for moments like these. Not the turbulence of an aircraft, not the emergency protocols or mechanical failures she had trained for as a pilot. No, this was a different kind of turbulence, the kind she had faced long before she ever stepped into a cockpit. The kind that didn't come from nature, but from people, their assumptions, their skepticism, their deeply ingrained belief that someone like her didn't belong in places of power, in positions of authority, in spaces where few had come before her. She had faced it when she was a little girl, wide-eyed with dreams of flying, only to be told by teachers and counselors that maybe she should consider something else. She had faced it in flight school, where instructors praised her precision but hesitated when it came time to recommend her for leadership roles. She had faced it as a young pilot, walking onto a tarmac in her uniform, only to be mistaken for a flight attendant more times than she could count. And now she was on the other side of those obstacles, a seasoned captain with thousands of flight hours under her belt, with a career that spoke for itself. And yet, here she was again, still navigating the same biases, the same small-mindedness, the same quiet doubts disguised as curiosity or politeness. The whispers had not stopped. The man in the navy suit was still smirking, still murmuring with his seatmate, still glancing back at Danielle as though she was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Heather and Melissa, the flight attendants who had spent the first part of this flight questioning her presence, had now swung in the other direction, ignoring her completely. Danielle recognized the pattern. If they couldn't make her feel unwelcome, they would make her feel invisible. And that was almost worse. She pressed her fingertips lightly against the armrest, steadying herself, grounding herself in the moment. She would not let this rattle her, because this wasn't new. This was just another flight, another room full of people who didn't know who she was, another moment where she was being underestimated and, in a way, that was almost funny to her now. Because when the moment came, when the situation shifted, when they needed her expertise, her leadership, her skill, they would see. Danielle had seen this shift before. It was always the same. She had walked onto aircrafts, ignored by passengers who assumed she was part of the cabin crew, only to watch their faces change completely when she took her place in the cockpit. She had stood in meetings with executives, dismissed as an assistant, until she started speaking, and suddenly the room listened. She had seen the moment when doubt turned to dependence, when people who had looked down on her realized they needed her. She didn't wish for a crisis. She never wanted things to go wrong. But she also knew if the plane hit turbulence, if an emergency happened, if the people in this cabin suddenly found themselves in real danger, the very same passengers who had been whispering, smirking, dismissing her, they would be looking to her for answers, because that was how it always happened. Danielle glanced down at her hands. Steady, always steady. She thought about the generations before her, the women who had broken barriers long before she had stepped foot in an airplane. She thought about her mother, who had fought to be heard in boardrooms filled with men who refused to take her seriously. She thought about her grandmother, who had been one of the first black nurses in her city, who had endured endless comments from patients who didn't trust her simply because of the color of her skin. She thought about all the stories she had heard, the struggles that had paved the way for her to even be here, sitting in this seat, wearing this uniform, holding this title. And she thought about the responsibility that came with that. Because she knew, every time she walked into a room, sat in a meeting, boarded a plane as a passenger, she wasn't just representing herself. She was carrying the weight of every woman who came before her, and the weight of every young girl who might come after her. That was the real reason she never let them see her shaken. That was the real reason she refused to let their doubt become her own. She wasn't just flying for herself. She was flying for all of them. The plane hit a slight pocket of turbulence, nothing serious, just enough for passengers to tighten their grips on their armrests, just enough to make the whispers fade into silence. Danielle barely reacted. She had flown through worse storms than this, both in the sky and in life. Let them watch her. Let them doubt her. She wasn't here for them. She wasn't here for their validation. She had earned her place in the sky, and she didn't need their approval to stay there. So she took another sip of her champagne, set the glass down with practiced precision, and gazed out the window. She wasn't looking for their respect. She had her own, and that was enough, for now. The plane had been in the air for nearly an hour when the first jolt of turbulence hit. It wasn't the minor kind, the small, forgettable shakes that made passengers grip their armrests for a second before relaxing. No, this was different. Danielle Parker knew turbulence. She had flown through storms, guided aircraft through unstable air, and read the sky like a second language. And this wasn't just turbulence. Danielle sat up slightly in her seat, her fingers tightening around the armrest as she felt the shift in the aircraft. A drop, then another. The overhead compartments trembled. Around her, passengers were reacting now, some murmuring, some gripping their drinks a little tighter, some trying to convince themselves this was normal. Danielle knew better. She had spent years in the cockpit, and this kind of instability wasn't routine. She glanced around the cabin, noting the subtle tension in the flight attendants' faces as they moved through the aisles. Heather, the blonde flight attendant who had dismissed her earlier, was forcing a smile, but Danielle could see the strain behind it. Then came the second jolt, harder this time. Sharp enough that several passengers gasped, a few audibly cursing. Danielle instinctively counted the seconds between the shifts. 5, 7, 12, not good. Turbulence had a rhythm, and when that rhythm was erratic, it usually meant something was off with the aircraft itself. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, but something about it wasn't right. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some unexpected turbulence," the captain said, his voice composed but slightly strained. "Nothing to be alarmed about. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Danielle narrowed her eyes. That wasn't how a pilot spoke in turbulence. She could hear it, something in the tone, the pacing. It wasn't just turbulence. Something was happening in that cockpit. Another jolt, this one more forceful than before. The cabin tilted slightly, an unnatural shift that made Danielle's instincts scream at her. She caught sight of Melissa, the younger flight attendant, gripping the back of a seat. Her expression was too tense, her movements too deliberate as she checked on passengers. Danielle's pulse quickened. She had seen this before, flight attendants playing calm when they knew something was wrong. She watched closely as Melissa whispered something to Heather, both of them exchanging a glance that practically radiated concern. They knew whatever was happening wasn't normal. Danielle's gaze flickered toward the cockpit door. Something wasn't right, and if something was wrong with the pilots, if they were in trouble, then this flight had a much bigger problem than turbulence. The plane lurched violently, not just a jolt, a full drop, as if the aircraft had suddenly lost altitude in a way it wasn't supposed to. A few drinks spilled, someone screamed, a child started crying. And for the first time, the flight attendants looked genuinely afraid. Danielle's instincts kicked in full force. She unbuckled her seatbelt, ready to move. "Ma'am, please remain seated," Heather snapped, appearing at her side instantly. Danielle met her eyes, her voice low and firm. "What's going on in the cockpit?" Heather hesitated. It was small, a half second of hesitation, but Danielle caught it. "I said remain seated," Heather repeated. But this time, her voice wasn't as sharp. Danielle's jaw tightened. She turned slightly and saw Melissa rushing toward the cockpit door. Melissa knocked twice, quick, urgent, then whispered something into the intercom. Danielle's breath stilled. They were trying to reach the pilots, and they weren't answering. Every muscle in Danielle's body went on high alert. The moment Melissa turned away from the intercom, Danielle was already moving toward her. "Something's wrong in the cockpit," she said, her voice steady. "You need to let me in." Melissa froze, her eyes flickering between Danielle and Heather, clearly unsure of what to do. Heather scowled. "Ma'am, I'm a commercial airline captain," Danielle cut in, pulling her pilot credentials from her blazer pocket and holding them up. "And right now you have a serious problem up front. Let me in." Melissa's eyes widened, her breath catching. Heather, however, still looked resistant. "I don't know if I can just—" "You don't have time for this," Danielle snapped. "If your pilots aren't responding, we're in danger. I need to know what's happening, now." Another drop. This time, it was hard enough that several people screamed, the plane shaking violently. Melissa didn't wait any longer. She turned, hit the emergency code on the cockpit door, and the lock clicked open. Heather stepped aside, still stunned. Danielle didn't hesitate. She pushed the door open, and immediately, her worst fears were confirmed. The captain was slumped in his seat, unresponsive, his face pale. The first officer was gripping the controls, sweating, his hands shaking, clearly panicked. He was barely keeping control of the aircraft. Danielle took one look at the instruments and saw exactly what was wrong. The plane had lost partial control, autopilot had failed, and the first officer was struggling to manually stabilize the descent. Danielle took over instantly. She grabbed the radio and spoke in the calm, commanding voice of a veteran pilot. "This is Captain Danielle Parker, taking control of Flight 782. We have a medical emergency in the cockpit, and I am assuming command of this aircraft." The first officer's head snapped toward her, eyes wide. "Well, wait, who are you?" he stammered. Danielle's hands were already on the controls. "Your best chance of getting out of this alive." She switched to the emergency frequency, speaking with absolute confidence. "We are experiencing flight instability and require immediate priority clearance for an emergency landing. Stand by for coordinates." The ground control's response was immediate. "Copy that, Captain Parker. Confirm your status. Danielle didn't look away from the controls. First officer is unstable. Captain is unresponsive. I am taking over. The first officer exhaled a shaky breath, still wide-eyed. You're really a captain? Danielle didn't even blink. Strap in and follow my lead, she said. And just like that, she was in charge. The very same people who had questioned whether she belonged in first class, now their lives were in her hands, and she was about to save them all. The moment Olivia Carter's hands touched the controls, she felt the aircraft's instability like a second heartbeat. She had spent years in the cockpit, flying through hurricanes, handling emergency landings, and making split-second decisions that determined whether people lived or died. And right now, this plane needed her. The first officer, a young man barely in his 30s, was breathing heavily, his fingers clenched so tightly around the control yoke that his knuckles had turned white. The captain was still unresponsive, his head slumped against the side panel, his breathing shallow. Olivia didn't have time to assess his condition. Right now, the aircraft came first. She scanned the instruments, her eyes moving quickly, precisely, absorbing everything at once. Altitude unstable, speed fluctuating, left engine overheating. Her brain processed it all in seconds, making calculations as fast as her fingers moved. She adjusted the trim, compensating for the sudden loss of stability. She felt the plane respond beneath her, a slight shift, a subtle pull that told her she had bought them some time. But they weren't out of danger yet. She turned to the first officer, her voice steady, commanding. Breathe. The young man's chest rose and fell rapidly, panic still in his wide eyes. Olivia had seen this before, rookie pilots caught in their first real emergency, their training fighting against their fear. If he lost control, he could make one wrong move and send them into disaster. I said breathe, Olivia repeated, sharper this time. His throat bobbed as he swallowed, and he sucked in a shaky breath. Tell me your name, she said, deliberately grounding him. Tyler. Tyler Reese. Okay, Tyler, Olivia said, adjusting their descent rate. I need you to listen to me carefully. I've got the aircraft under control, but I need you to focus. Tyler nodded quickly, his breathing slowing slightly. Good, Olivia said. Now, what happened? Tyler's hands flexed against the yoke. The captain said he wasn't feeling well about 20 minutes ago. Then he just collapsed. Olivia nodded once, her mind racing. Medical emergency. Pilot incapacitated. Worst case scenario, but not impossible to recover from. They could still land this plane, but they had to act fast. She grabbed the radio, flipping to the emergency frequency. This is Captain Olivia Carter, taking command of Flight 782, she announced, her voice clear, firm, unshakable. We are experiencing flight instability due to a medical emergency. The captain is unresponsive. I am assuming control and preparing for an emergency landing. A crackle of static, then the dispatcher's urgent response. Copy that, Captain Carter. Confirm number of crew able to assist. Olivia glanced at Tyler. First officer is conscious but shaken. I am flying this aircraft. There was a beat of silence. Then, understood, Captain Carter. Priority landing clearance granted. Diverting you to Memphis International. Weather conditions are stable. Can you confirm aircraft status? Olivia's fingers danced across the controls, checking their fuel reserves, wind speeds, and engine pressure. Left engine overheating, but functional. No pressure loss. Manual controls are responsive, she reported. Copy that, ground control responded. Emergency personnel will be standing by. How long until descent? Olivia made a quick calculation. 17 minutes, she said. She adjusted her grip, her voice unwavering as she gave her final directive. Clear the runway. I'm bringing this plane down. Back in the first-class cabin, the tension was palpable. Passengers clutched their armrests. Some prayed. Others sat in stunned silence, watching the flight attendants whisper urgently to one another. Heather, the flight attendant who had treated Olivia with thinly veiled contempt, stood near the galley, pale and shaken. She had spent the first half of this flight convinced Olivia didn't belong here. Now she was watching her save their lives. Passengers who had once whispered, doubted, judged, they were now silent. Because they knew that the woman they had ignored, dismissed, and underestimated was now the only reason they had a chance of survival. In the cockpit, Tyler's breathing had evened out, his hands no longer trembling. He had found his rhythm again, because Olivia had given it back to him. We're approaching descent, Olivia said, her voice even. Lower the flaps, adjust for crosswind. Tyler followed her instructions without hesitation. He was trusting her now, because he saw it, the way she moved, the way she commanded the aircraft without a single moment of doubt. She wasn't just capable, she was a master at this. And for the first time since this emergency began, he believed they were going to make it. The city lights of Memphis appeared in the distance. Olivia kept her hands steady, guiding the plane through its final descent. She adjusted the speed, perfectly aligning their trajectory for the emergency landing. Ground control came through the radio. Flight 782, you are cleared for immediate landing. Emergency team standing by. Olivia's fingers moved swiftly, checking every last detail. She exhaled one steady breath. Then, we're going in. The runway stretched before them, the tarmac glowing under the airport lights. Olivia executed a flawless approach, the aircraft responding to her like it had been waiting for her hands all along. The wheels hit the ground, the impact absorbed as Olivia smoothly engaged the reverse thrusters. The plane slowed, steadied, and then, finally, came to a complete stop. For a second, there was only silence. Then cheers erupted from the cabin. Passengers who had once doubted her now clapped, sighed, cried in relief. Tyler let out a breathless, disbelieving laugh. "We made it," he whispered. Olivia exhaled, her grip on the controls relaxing for the first time. She had done what she always did. She had saved them, and now? Now they all knew exactly who she was. The moment the aircraft came to a complete stop on the runway, the tension in the cabin shifted. Passengers who had been gripping their armrests in fear only moments ago were now exhaling sighs of relief. Some wiping at their eyes, others pressing hands to their chests as if they couldn't believe they had just survived an emergency landing. And Olivia Carter? She was still in command mode. Her hands remained firm on the controls, her mind running through the post-landing checklist with the kind of efficiency and precision that came from years in the cockpit. The situation wasn't over yet. The captain was still unconscious. Emergency personnel would be rushing to the aircraft at any moment, and Olivia needed to ensure the safety of every person on board before she could even think about stepping away from the controls. But just as she was about to issue final landing procedures to the crew, resistance came from the last place she expected. Heather. The blonde flight attendant, who had spent the entire flight mocking Olivia with smirks and skepticism, now stood frozen near the cockpit door. She hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't acknowledged the fact that Olivia had just done what no one else could, saved the lives of every single person on board. Instead, Heather's lips were pressed into a thin, pale line, her arms crossed over her chest in a way that looked defensive rather than relieved. And when she finally spoke, the words that left her mouth were so absurd that Olivia nearly laughed at the audacity of them. "You weren't supposed to be in there," Heather said, her voice tight, forced. Olivia's head turned slowly, her expression unreadable. "Excuse me?" Heather exhaled sharply. I don't know if what you did was even protocol. You just walked into the cockpit. You." She gestured vaguely at the controls, her voice rising slightly, desperate to regain control of something that had long slipped through her fingers. "You took over like you had the right to." Olivia's stare was unblinking, sharp, unwavering, like a storm that hadn't passed yet. "The captain was unconscious," Olivia said, her voice so calm that it was almost chilling. "The first officer was panicked. The aircraft was in freefall. I had the experience, the training, and the ability to take control, so I did." Heather didn't answer right away, because what could she say? Everything Olivia had just stated was a fact. But the problem wasn't facts. The problem was Heather's pride, her biases, her unwillingness to accept that the very woman she had belittled, ignored, and dismissed was the one who had just saved her life. And so, instead of admitting she was wrong, Heather did what people like her always did. She deflected. "You still," Heather swallowed, her jaw tightening. "You shouldn't have just forced your way in." Olivia arched an eyebrow. "Forced?" she repeated, voice like ice. Heather flushed, but she lifted her chin slightly. I mean, you could have let the first officer handle it. You could have let him crash the plane," Olivia interrupted. Heather's mouth snapped shut. She looked away, as if searching for someone to back her up. But there was no one. Melissa, the younger flight attendant, was standing just behind her, eyes wide. Her lips parted slightly as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. And then there were the passengers, dozens of them, watching, listening. And they weren't on Heather's side. If anything, they were staring at her in disbelief, because they had seen what Olivia had done. They had seen her take control in the moment it mattered most. They had seen her save them. And now, this woman, this flight attendant who had been dismissing Olivia since the moment she boarded, was trying to act as though it hadn't happened. Trying to make it seem as though Olivia had overstepped. Trying to rewrite reality so that she wouldn't have to face the fact that she had been wrong. But Olivia wasn't going to let that happen. She took a slow step forward. Heather stepped back. "I want you to listen to me very carefully," Olivia said, her voice measured. Controlled, but carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. "You can stand there and argue all you want. You can try to convince yourself that what just happened wasn't real, but I'll tell you what is real. She gestured behind her toward the cockpit. That captain is alive because I stepped in. That first officer is alive because I took control. You are alive because I knew how to land this aircraft. She let the words sink in, and then her voice dropped lower. So, if you're looking for a reason to be upset, I suggest you find another one, because I don't have the patience for whatever story you're trying to tell yourself. Heather visibly flinched. Melissa looked away, as if secondhand embarrassment had hit her full force. And the passengers? They were done with Heather. Someone scoffed. Another passenger muttered, "Unbelievable." And then someone clapped. Just one person at first, then another, and another. Until suddenly the entire first-class cabin was applauding Olivia Carter. Not because she wanted their approval, not because she had asked for their recognition, but because the truth had become undeniable. She had saved them, and no amount of Heather's resentment would change that. As the applause rippled through the cabin, Olivia turned back toward the cockpit, her focus shifting to what really mattered. She pressed the intercom button. "This is Captain Carter," she announced. "Emergency medical personnel are cleared aboard. Passengers, please remain seated while first responders assist the crew." Then she turned to Melissa. "Go check on the captain," she instructed. Melissa nodded instantly, no hesitation in her response. And Heather? Heather remained silent. Because she knew that whatever power she thought she had over Olivia Carter had disappeared the moment Olivia saved her life. And she would have to live with that. The cabin doors swung open as emergency personnel rushed in, their uniforms crisp, their movements efficient. Passengers remained seated, still shaken but watching, absorbing everything. Some clutched their belongings, others whispered amongst themselves. But the eyes of nearly everyone in first class kept drifting back to one person, Olivia Carter, not Heather, not the first officer, not even the unconscious captain being carefully lifted from his seat by paramedics. Her. Because now they knew the truth. They had boarded this flight with assumptions, with the belief that they understood their world and their place in it. They had taken one look at Olivia, a black woman, sitting alone in first class, carrying herself with quiet authority, and assumed she was someone other than what she was. And yet, when the moment of crisis came, when the very people they expected to save them had failed, it had been Olivia who took control. It had been Olivia who landed the plane, and now the truth was undeniable. Melissa, the younger flight attendant, stood near the cockpit entrance, her gaze flickering between the paramedics and Olivia. She looked like she wanted to say something, like she had words sitting on the edge of her tongue, words that weren't quite an apology, but something close. Heather, on the other hand, was still silent, her arms folded, her jaw tight, because she wasn't ready to admit it, wasn't ready to acknowledge that the very woman she had mocked and ignored had just saved her life. And that was something she would have to live with. A voice cut through the murmurs. It was the businessman in the Navy suit, the one who had whispered about Olivia, smirking at her presence in first class. Now, he looked pale, his usual confidence replaced with unease. You really landed the plane?" he asked, his voice quieter than before. Olivia turned to him slowly. "Yes." A beat of silence. Then the woman across the aisle, the one who had questioned Olivia's career choices, spoke next. "But, you're really a pilot?" It wasn't meant to be insulting, but it was. Because even now, after everything, she still couldn't wrap her mind around it. Olivia inhaled deeply, keeping her expression measured, controlled. "Yes," she said again, her voice unwavering. "I am a captain for this airline. I have flown commercial aircraft for over 15 years. I have thousands of hours of experience. And tonight," she glanced at the passengers, letting the weight of her words settle. "Tonight, I was the only reason you all made it safely to the ground." A few passengers lowered their heads, avoiding her gaze. Others simply stared, as if still struggling to process the reality of it all. Heather let out a short, bitter breath, as if she had something to say, but before she could speak, someone began clapping. A single, deliberate clap, then another, and suddenly the entire first-class cabin was applauding Olivia Carter. Olivia stood there, unmoving, watching as the very people who had doubted her, underestimated her, and dismissed her were now clapping for her. Did it change what had happened? No. Did it erase the microaggressions, the skepticism, the quiet exclusions? No. Did it undo years of being questioned in her own profession? No. But still, for the first time that flight, Olivia saw something shift in their eyes. Recognition, awareness, and maybe, just maybe, a glimmer of respect. The applause faded as the paramedics prepared to move the captain off the plane. One of them turned to Olivia, offering a nod. "You handled that landing like a pro, Captain. Olivia accepted the praise with a simple nod, but before she could respond, Heather, still standing stiffly near the galley, spoke up. "Well," she said, her voice clipped, forced. "It's not like she did it alone. She had the first officer helping." The words were petty, grasping, desperate, a final attempt to regain some sense of control. But it was too late, because even Tyler, the young first officer who had been paralyzed with fear before Olivia took over, knew the truth. He turned to Heather, his voice firm for the first time all night. "No," he said, simply. "She saved us." Heather's mouth snapped shut, and with that the last of her resistance crumbled. As the paramedics carried the unconscious captain off the plane, Olivia stepped into the aisle, retrieving her carry-on from the overhead bin. She was ready to go. She had done what she needed to do. As she moved toward the exit, passengers parted for her. No one blocked her way, no one ignored her. And as she reached the door, the businessman in the navy suit called out, "Captain Carter?" She turned slightly. He swallowed, his face still filled with a quiet kind of shame. "Thank you." She studied him for a long moment. Then, with a small nod, she walked off the plane. She didn't need their thanks. She had always known who she was. Now, so did they. The second Olivia Carter took control of the aircraft, everything else faded away. The skeptical glances, the whispers, the quiet judgment that had followed her from the moment she stepped on board. None of that mattered now, because this plane, this metal giant carrying over 200 passengers, was in her hands. And she was going to land it. Olivia's instincts kicked in immediately. She scanned the cockpit, her eyes darting over the instruments, processing data in seconds. The aircraft was unstable, the left engine overheating, altitude fluctuating, but still salvageable. The first officer, Tyler Reese, was panicked but functional, gripping the controls with white-knuckled tension. The captain, however, was still slumped in his seat, unresponsive, his shallow breaths the only sign that he was still alive. Olivia didn't hesitate. "Tyler," she said, her voice low and firm, cutting through the chaos. He turned to her, his face slick with sweat, eyes wide with uncertainty. "Listen to me," she continued, anchoring him to the moment. "We are going to land this plane safely, you and me, but I need you to focus." Tyler swallowed hard, nodding. "Oh, okay." "Good." Olivia's hands moved swiftly over the controls, stabilizing their descent. "Tell me everything that happened before the captain collapsed." Tyler licked his lips, his breath still uneven. He said he wasn't feeling well. Dizziness, nausea. I told him to rest, but then he gestured toward the unconscious man beside him. Olivia nodded, already calculating possibilities in her head. Cardiac event? Stroke? Extreme dehydration? It didn't matter right now. What mattered was keeping this plane in the air long enough to land it safely. She pressed the radio switch. "This is Captain Olivia Carter. I have assumed command of Flight 782 due to a medical emergency in the cockpit. We require immediate emergency landing clearance." The ground controller responded immediately, his voice urgent. "Copy that, Captain Carter. Diverting you to Memphis International. Do you require medical assistance upon landing?" "Yes," Olivia confirmed. "The captain is unresponsive. First officer is functional but shaken. I'm flying this aircraft." There was a slight pause, a hesitation she had heard before. They weren't expecting her. They weren't expecting a black woman's voice on the other end of the line, taking control. But then professionalism took over. "Understood, Captain Carter. Memphis International is clearing a runway for you now. Wind speeds are stable, weather conditions clear." "Copy that," Olivia said. "We are beginning our descent." In first class, passengers were starting to understand what was happening. For the past hour, they had been whispering about her, doubting her, dismissing her presence in their space. Now, those same passengers were realizing she was their only hope of survival. Heather, the flight attendant who had spent most of the flight avoiding Olivia's presence, stood frozen near the galley, her face pale. Melissa, the younger attendant, had already begun reassuring passengers, though Olivia could hear the slight tremor in her voice as she spoke. The businessman who had smirked at Olivia earlier was now silent, his fingers tapping anxiously against his armrest. And the woman who had asked if Olivia was really a pilot? She was gripping the seat in front of her, her knuckles white. They had spent the flight questioning her authority. Now, they were depending on it. Olivia adjusted the descent, calculating every detail with practiced ease. "Flaps down," she instructed. Tyler complied instantly, his movements still a little stiff, but he was getting there. "We're coming in slow, no sudden movements," Olivia continued. "You keep an eye on the altitude. I'll handle the controls." Tyler nodded, his breathing steadier now. Memphis International was visible ahead. The runway stretched out beneath the night sky, glowing under the airport lights. On the radio, ground control was still guiding them in. Flight 782, you are cleared for immediate landing. Emergency response team standing by. Olivia exhaled, steadying her hands. We're going in, she said. The plane descended smoothly, Olivia keeping a perfect glide path despite the earlier instability. Tyler adjusted the throttle. Landing gear engaged, he reported. Olivia nodded, eyes locked on the runway ahead. Keep it steady. Her fingers moved instinctively, making micro-adjustments only a seasoned pilot would know how to execute. The wheels touched down, the impact smooth despite the rough conditions, the reverse thrusters engaged. The plane slowed, steadied, and finally came to a complete stop. For a moment there was only silence. Then, a wave of cheers and relieved sighs erupted from the cabin. Passengers clapped, cried, hugged each other, their fear finally releasing now that they were safely on the ground. Tyler let out a breathless, disbelieving laugh. We did it. Olivia relaxed her grip on the controls for the first time. She had done what she always did. She had saved them. The aftermath paramedics boarded the plane immediately, attending to the unconscious captain. Olivia remained in the cockpit as she completed the landing checklist, her professionalism never wavering. Tyler turned to her, his expression still filled with awe and respect. I don't even know what to say, he admitted. Olivia offered a small, knowing smile. Next time, she said, you stay calm, you listen, and you trust your team. Tyler nodded, clearly taking her words to heart. As she unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped into the cabin, the first-class passengers were still staring at her. They weren't whispering anymore. They weren't questioning her presence. They were simply looking at the woman who had saved their lives and realizing how wrong they had been about her. Heather, still standing near the galley, lowered her gaze as Olivia walked past. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Olivia grabbed her carry-on bag and headed for the exit. As she stepped off the aircraft and onto the jet bridge, she felt the cool night air hit her face. And she smiled. Because once again, despite the odds, despite the resistance, despite the doubt, she had proven them all wrong. And she always would. The wheels touched down with a controlled thud, the aircraft gliding smoothly onto the illuminated runway of Memphis International Airport. Every instinct in Olivia Carter's body remained sharp, focused. She kept her grip steady, her years of experience guiding the plane through the delicate balance of slowing its momentum without creating unnecessary turbulence. Reverse thrusters engaged, brakes applied at the perfect rate, every movement executed with precise expertise. Outside, flashing emergency lights lined the runway, fire trucks, ambulances, airport security, all waiting, prepared for the worst. But thanks to Olivia Carter, the worst had been avoided. She had done it. She had saved them all. For a second, there was only silence inside the plane. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the passengers were holding their breath, waiting for confirmation that they were truly, finally, safe. Then, cheers erupted throughout the cabin, a collective release of breath. Some passengers clapped. Others sobbed into their hands. Strangers reached for each other, sharing a moment of relief, of gratitude, of disbelief that they had just survived an emergency landing. In first class, the businessman in the navy suit, who had once questioned Olivia's presence, sat frozen, his fingers still gripping the seat in front of him. The woman who had asked Olivia if she was really a pilot exhaled shakily, eyes wide with a mixture of shock and shame. Heather, the flight attendant who had mocked Olivia earlier, stood rigid near the galley, her face pale. No one doubted who had saved them now, and no one could deny the truth anymore. Olivia, however, didn't bask in the applause. She was still working, still focused. Her hands moved effortlessly over the control panel, ensuring that every post-landing procedure was executed correctly. Engines shutting down, she said, more to herself than anyone else. Tyler Reese, the first officer, let out a shaky breath, his posture relaxing slightly. We made it, he murmured, almost in disbelief. Olivia gave him a single nod. We did. She flicked the radio switch connecting to ground control. Memphis International, this is Flight 782. We are safely on the ground. Medical personnel may board. Crew and passengers accounted for. No further immediate risks. The response was instant, filled with urgency. Copy that, Captain Carter. Emergency teams are approaching now. Stand by. Captain Carter. It wasn't lost on Olivia that this was the first time they had called her that, without hesitation, without doubt. Recognition had come at last. The jet bridge extended and locked into place. Within moments, the cabin doors opened and paramedics rushed inside. They headed straight for the cockpit, lifting the unconscious captain carefully from his seat, assessing his vitals. Still breathing, one of them confirmed. We'll get him to a hospital immediately. Olivia stepped back, giving them space, her mind already moving to the next steps. The captain would recover. The first officer had learned a lesson he would never forget. And the passengers? They had just witnessed what real leadership looked like. Olivia stepped into the aisle, finally taking in the faces of the people she had just saved. There was no more doubt in their eyes now, only understanding. And for some, shame. The businessman in the navy suit, who had once dismissed her, finally met her gaze. He hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you." The woman across the aisle, the one who had questioned Olivia's career, swallowed hard. You really flew this plane," she said softly, still trying to process it. "Yes," Olivia said simply. There was nothing else to say. The truth was in front of them now, undeniable, unshakable. And for the first time since the flight began, no one questioned if she belonged here. As Olivia reached the front of the cabin, she locked eyes with Heather. The flight attendant had spent the entire flight belittling her, mocking her, trying to erase her presence in first class. And yet, when everything fell apart, Heather had been helpless, while Olivia had been the only one capable of taking control. Heather's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something. But what could she say? There were no excuses, no justifications, no way to erase what had happened. So instead, she just lowered her head. And Olivia? She simply walked past her, because she had nothing left to prove. As Olivia stepped off the aircraft, the night air hit her face, cool, fresh, grounding. She could hear the commotion behind her, the murmurs, the stunned voices of passengers still grappling with the reality of what had just happened. But she didn't turn back. She had done her job. She had done what she was trained to do, and she had done it better than anyone expected. As she walked through the terminal, a voice called out, "Captain Carter!" She turned. Tyler Reese, the first officer, was jogging to catch up with her, his expression filled with genuine respect. He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "I just wanted to say, I was wrong about you." Olivia raised an eyebrow, waiting. Tyler exhaled, his gaze steady. "And I'm glad you were here." Olivia studied him for a moment, then offered a small, knowing nod. "Next time," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "You trust your captain." Tyler nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am." And just like that, everything had changed, not just for him, but for everyone who had been on that plane, because they had all learned something that night, that assumptions are dangerous, that biases can be deadly, and that sometimes the person you least expect to lead is the only one who can. But tonight, the world had finally caught up. The lights of Memphis International Airport flickered through the terminal's glass windows as passengers from Flight 782 slowly made their way into the waiting area. Their steps were unsteady, their minds still processing the reality of what had just happened. Some were grateful, whispering prayers of relief. Others were silent, their gazes unfocused, still rattled by how close they had come to disaster. And then there were those whose expressions held something deeper: shame, realization, understanding. Because tonight they had witnessed something that shattered their assumptions, and there was no going back. The businessman in the navy suit, the one who had subtly dismissed Olivia Carter's presence in first class, sat in one of the chairs near the gate, staring down at his shaking hands. He had walked onto that plane believing he understood the world and the people in it, that certain people belonged in certain places, that a woman like Olivia, a black woman with quiet confidence and undeniable presence, was someone to be questioned, not trusted. But in the moment when it mattered most, when his life was hanging in the balance, he had trusted her, because he had no other choice, and she had saved him. Not out of spite, not out of a need to prove anything, but simply because she was a damn good pilot. The realization sat heavy in his chest, an uncomfortable weight pressing down on years of ingrained bias. He exhaled, his fingers tightening around the armrests. A few feet away, the middle-aged woman who had asked Olivia if she was really a pilot stood near the baggage claim, her phone clutched in her trembling hands. Her mind kept replaying that moment on the plane, when she had laughed at the idea of Olivia being in the cockpit, when she had assumed Olivia's success was an anomaly rather than the result of years of experience and skill. And now she felt sick, because she had spent a lifetime believing in a world that no longer existed, a world where people like Olivia had to justify their presence, their talent, their excellence. Tonight, Olivia had needed no justification. She had let her actions speak for themselves, and there was no denying the truth anymore. Heather, the flight attendant who had mocked Olivia, dismissed her, and treated her like an outsider from the start, stood near the gate alone. Her arms were crossed over her chest, her shoulders stiff, tense, her jaw tight. She had spent the entire flight looking down on Olivia, convinced that she didn't belong, not in first class, not as a respected professional, not as someone worthy of recognition. And yet when the moment of crisis came, when the very people she trusted had failed, it had been Olivia who stepped up. Olivia who took control. Olivia who saved her life. Heather exhaled sharply, rubbing at her forehead. She wanted to defend herself, to make excuses for why she had acted the way she did. She wanted to say that she hadn't really meant it, that her bias was unintentional, that she had just been caught off guard. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had spent the entire flight underestimating Olivia Carter. And tonight? Tonight, she had been proven wrong in the most humiliating way possible. She wasn't ready to apologize, not yet. Maybe not ever. But she would have to live with this truth for the rest of her life, and that was its own kind of reckoning. As Olivia stepped through the terminal, her steps measured, her expression calm, she felt the weight of the passengers' stares. The same people who had spent the flight questioning her now looked at her with something else entirely. Not skepticism, not doubt, but respect. Some passengers nodded at her as she passed. Some murmured thank you under their breath. And others? They simply watched, knowing they had been part of something they would never forget. Olivia didn't need their validation. She had known who she was long before this flight. She had spent years proving herself in ways they would never understand. But tonight, they had been forced to see her for what she was, not an anomaly, not an exception, but a leader, a pilot. The only reason they had survived. A new kind of applause as she approached the exit. A voice called out behind her. "Captain Carter." She turned. It was Tyler Reese, the first officer, his expression filled with something that looked like awe and regret all at once. He swallowed hard. "I just wanted to say, I was wrong about you." Olivia arched an eyebrow. "I was wrong to doubt you," he continued. "You were the only reason we made it through that." Olivia studied him for a long moment. Then she simply nodded. "Next time," she said, her voice even, "trust your captain." Tyler nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am." And just like that, Olivia walked away, stepping into the night air. She didn't need their apologies. She didn't need their applause. She had always known her worth. Now the world knew it too. The cold night air wrapped around Olivia Carter as she stepped out of the airport terminal, the hum of conversations, distant sirens, and the occasional honk of a taxi filling the space around her. The night had been long, too long. But she had done what she always did. She had remained calm, she had taken control, and she had saved lives. She exhaled deeply, rolling her shoulders to ease the tension still lingering in her body. The weight of the past few hours was beginning to settle, not in exhaustion, but in something heavier. Not because she had proven herself, she had done that long ago, but because tonight had been another reminder. A reminder that no matter how many times she proved her worth, there would always be those who questioned it. Passengers who had stared at her with skepticism the moment she boarded. Flight attendants who had whispered behind her back, questioning her presence in first class. A first officer who had doubted her abilities even as the plane was in crisis. And yet, when the moment of truth arrived, when everything depended on her expertise, she had been the only one capable of saving them all. She had always known who she was. The difference now was that they knew it too. As Olivia waited for her rideshare, she reached into her carry-on bag, pulling out her phone. A handful of emails from the airline. A notification from air traffic control confirming the emergency landing report. A message from an old colleague who must have heard what happened, but Olivia didn't feel the need to respond yet. She had done her job, and for the first time that night she allowed herself to feel it. Not pride, not arrogance, just a quiet, steady confirmation that she had been enough. Not because she had proven something to the people on that plane, but because she had never needed to prove anything in the first place. Inside the terminal, the passengers were still grappling with what had happened. Some were rethinking their assumptions, some were questioning their own biases, and some, like Heather, the flight attendant who had mocked her, were too stubborn to admit their mistakes, but were feeling the weight of them nonetheless. That was their burden to carry, not Olivia's. She wasn't responsible for changing their minds. She wasn't responsible for making them see her value. Her value had been there long before they had doubted her, and it would still be there long after they had gone home. Her ride pulled up, and she slid into the back seat, finally allowing herself to relax as the car pulled away from the airport. Outside, the city stretched before her, bright lights, towering buildings, a world that kept moving no matter what had happened in the sky hours before. And Olivia? She was moving too. She wasn't looking back. She wasn't seeking approval. She wasn't waiting for anyone's validation, because everything she needed, she already had within her. Life has a way of testing us, often in moments when we least expect it. Sometimes it comes in the form of external challenges, people who doubt us, obstacles that seem insurmountable, or a world that refuses to see our worth. Other times, the greatest battle is within ourselves, the quiet fight to hold on to our dignity, our confidence, and our belief in who we are, despite what others may say. The story of Olivia Carter is not just about a pilot who landed a plane in an emergency. It is about resilience in the face of prejudice, about staying steadfast when others refuse to see your value, and about proving, through actions rather than words, that skill, competence, and leadership are not bound by race, gender, or societal expectations. For many of us, particularly those who have lived long enough to see history unfold, these lessons are not new. We have witnessed change. We have seen times when people were underestimated simply because of who they were. We have also seen moments when individuals, through sheer strength of character, rose above doubt and proved themselves beyond question. This story reminds us of an essential truth. Our worth is not defined by others' opinions of us. Olivia did not seek validation from the people who doubted her. She did not waste time trying to convince them of her abilities. Instead, when the moment of crisis came, she let her actions speak for themselves. And in doing so, she taught those around her a lesson they would never forget. In life, we may find ourselves in similar situations. People may doubt our abilities. They may dismiss our experience. They may assume we do not belong. But just like Olivia, the most powerful response is not anger or resentment. It is grace, confidence, and action. There is also a lesson for those who made assumptions about Olivia. Many people on that plane judged her before they knew her story. They saw what they expected to see, rather than what was truly in front of them. And when faced with the truth, they had to reckon with their own biases and limitations. This is a reminder for all of us. We must be careful about the assumptions we make. Life has a way of surprising us, and people are often more capable, more experienced, and more extraordinary than we give them credit for. The challenge, especially as we grow older, is to remain open-minded, willing to listen, and ready to learn, even from unexpected sources. For those of us who have spent decades navigating life's hardships, we know that true strength comes not from seeking approval, but from knowing, deep in our hearts, who we are and what we stand for. So, as we reflect on this story, let us remember, carry yourself with quiet confidence. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. Your experience, wisdom, and abilities speak for themselves. Judge less, listen more. We are never too old to learn from others and to correct misconceptions. Stay true to your values. At the end of the day, what matters is not how others see you, but how you see yourself. No matter where we are in life, there will always be moments when we must stand firm in who we are, despite what others believe. And just like Olivia Carter, we must remember, our worth has never been in question. We just need to keep moving forward and let the world catch up.